The sun hammered down on Joint Task Force Bravo's airstrip like a punishment, turning the gravel into a white-hot mirror that made everything shimmer with distortion. Specialist Rachel Torres wiped sweat from her forehead as she knelt beside her gear, methodically checking the latch toggles on her collapsible kayak for the third time that morning. Around her, the base buzzed with the kind of energy that only came before a major operation, voices sharp with adrenaline, equipment gleaming under inspection, everyone moving with purpose. Everyone except her. Rachel had been stationed at Bravo for 8 months now, officially listed as logistics support in a unit that barely acknowledged logistics existed. While Navy SEALs like Petty Officer Marcus Webb strutted between their rigid inflatable boats' hulls waxed to perfection, engines displayed like trophies, Rachel worked in the shadows. Her kayak, a custom-modified Navy-issued hull reinforced with resin patches she'd molded herself, sat forgotten beside the supply crates like an afterthought. "Hey, Torres!" Webb's voice carried across the staging area, followed by the familiar sound of snickering. "You planning to paddle that bathtub into a combat zone, or is it just for the press photos?" Rachel didn't look up. She'd learned months ago that acknowledging their comments only invited more. Instead, she focused on threading the shock cord through the rear deck fitting, her movements precise and practiced. The modifications she'd made weren't pretty, but they were functional, something these spotlight-hungry SEALs wouldn't understand. "Maybe she's doing latte runs," Corporal Jake Martinez from Canadian Command chimed in, nudging Webb with his elbow. "Low-profile coffee retrieval." The laughter that followed echoed off the container walls, sharp and dismissive. Rachel's jaw tightened, but her hands remained steady. She'd inherited her father's patience, along with his faded squadron patch, the one she kept wrapped in cloth, hidden in her gear bag like a secret. Chief Petty Officer Miguel Torres had been a Navy rescue swimmer who understood that real heroes didn't always wear the flashiest gear or command the biggest boats. Webb's radio crackled to life, and suddenly his attention shifted to more important matters. The SEALs gathered around their high-tech equipment, discussing sensor arrays and satellite uplinks with the kind of confidence that came from never being questioned. Rachel continued her prep work, invisible once again. But invisibility had its advantages. While Webb and his team posed for photographers and joked with British liaisons, Rachel studied the flood reports that came in every hour. The numbers were getting worse, water levels rising faster than predicted, debris fields expanding, access routes disappearing one by one. The town they were supposed to evacuate was becoming more isolated by the minute. From inside the operations tent, Public Affairs Officer Diana Knox's voice drifted over the loudspeakers, polished and controlled. Day 3 of joint coastal deployment is underway. Alpha through Echo teams are on standby. Support staff, please maintain distance from operational areas. Support staff. That's all she was to them. Rachel clicked the front snap lock into place and wiped the pressure seal with her sleeve. Her kayak was ready, even if nobody cared. She rechecked the waterproof pouch she'd stitched into the seat back, her fingers brushing against the corner of a folded paper sealed in plastic, her own hand-drawn map, complete with flood overlays and current vectors that the digital systems couldn't calculate. A drone operator walked by, tilting his phone toward her kayak. #Stealth Logistics, he announced, snapping a photo. Delta Force, now inflatable. More laughter. Rachel stood slowly, ran her thumb along the paddle blade, and tucked it into the side holster. The caption on his photo would probably read, "Support unknown female," just like all the others. But as she sat on the low bench by the shade tarp and sipped from her water flask, Rachel felt something the SEALs didn't certainty. While they relied on engines that could fail and electronics that could short out, she had something simpler. Skill, preparation, and a kayak that had never let her down. The water was rising. Her gear was ready. Soon, they'd need someone who could go where their fancy boats couldn't follow. They just didn't know it yet. The storage tent felt like a sanctuary compared to the chaos outside. Rachel sat cross-legged. On her sleeping mat, a soft red lantern casting gentle light across the waterproof chart spread before her. While the base pulsed with artificial light and the constant drone of machinery, she worked in peaceful silence, tracing flood projections. With a grease pencil, her maps didn't match the digital updates loaded into the command terminals. They were better. Where the computers showed clean topographical lines, Rachel's charts revealed the messy reality of how water actually behaved when it met uneven ground, debris, and desperate currents. Her father had taught her to read water like a language. "Rivers don't just flow, Maya," he'd said during those quiet hours in their garage, patching canoes and sharpening rescue gear. "They negotiate, they bargain. They find ways around things that seem impossible." Rachel smiled at the memory, then sobered as she looked at tonight's projections. The flood was accelerating, and the official evacuation routes were disappearing, faster than command wanted to admit. She traced an alternate path with her pencil narrow, dangerous, but possible for someone who understood how water moved through debris fields. A burst of laughter from outside broke her concentration. Through the tent walls, she could hear Webb and his team rehashing their greatest hits from previous deployments, their voices carrying the easy confidence of men who'd never been ignored or dismissed. ... And then Torres here suggests we paddle through the storm surge in her little yellow boat. Webb's voice was thick with amusement. "I swear, sometimes I think she's living in her own action movie." Rachel's hand stilled on the map. She hadn't suggested anything to Webb. She'd never been asked for her input on anything. But that didn't stop him from spinning stories that made her sound foolish and unprepared. Martinez's voice joined in. "Hey, at least she's enthusiastic. Remember when she volunteered for that night patrol route that was completely underwater?" "She volunteered?" Another voice, one Rachel didn't recognize. "I thought command just couldn't find anyone else willing to do supply runs in a kayak." More laughter. Rachel forced herself to breathe steadily, her father's voice echoing in her memory. "Don't let them see you react, Mia. Do your work. Be ready. When the moment comes, you'll be the one they need." She reached into her gear bag and carefully unwrapped the faded squadron patch, the last thing her father had given her before Hurricane Elena took in during a rescue operation 3 years ago. The embroidery was nearly worn smooth, but she could still make out the wings and anchor that had meant everything to him. "Stay small, stay ready," she whispered, repeating the motto he'd lived by. Outside, a radio crackled with another weather update. The storm was intensifying faster than predicted. Flood levels were rising in areas that weren't supposed to see water for another 12 hours. Rachel looked back at her map, then reached for a different colored pencil. If the projections were wrong, and her gut told her they were, then the official evacuation routes would be completely useless by morning. But her alternate path, the one she'd been plotting and replotting for weeks, might be the only way in or out of the affected areas. She worked for another hour, cross-referencing water speeds with debris reports, calculating angles and approach vectors that would make sense only to someone who'd spent their life studying rivers and floods. When she finished, she had something no one else on base possessed: a viable route into the disaster zone. Rachel folded the map carefully and sealed it in waterproof plastic. Tomorrow, she'd try again to share her findings with command. She'd tried before polite requests for a moment of Lieutenant Commander Harrison's time, respectful suggestions submitted through proper channels, but her recommendations always seemed to disappear into the bureaucratic void. Still, she'd keep trying, because somewhere out there, people were waiting for rescue, and she was starting to understand that she might be the only one who could reach them. The lantern flickered once as she packed her gear. Through the tent walls, she could Hear the SEALs finally heading to their quarters, their voices fading into the distance. Soon, the base would settle into its nighttime rhythm skeleton crews monitoring communications, guards walking their routes, and Rachel Torres, invisible as always, preparing for a mission no one had asked her to accept. She wrapped her father's patch and tucked it away, but this time she left it where she could reach it quickly. Something told her she'd need his courage sooner than expected. The operations tent exploded with noise as the third alarm chimed across the communication board. Rachel stood at the edge of the controlled chaos, watching officers cluster around flickering screens that painted an increasingly hopeless picture. The second wave of flooding had arrived 6 hours ahead of schedule, turning every carefully planned evacuation route into a death trap. Lieutenant Commander Harrison leaned over the primary display, sweat beading on his forehead as reports flooded in. "Status on Alpha Team? Engine failure at Checkpoint 7, came the crackling response. "Hull breach from debris impact. They're requesting immediate extraction. Bravo Team? Stuck under a collapsed overpass. They've got power, but can't move. Current's too strong." Rachel watched Harrison's face pale as each team reported the same story: advanced equipment failing, routes blocked, rescue teams becoming victims themselves. The rigid inflatable boats that looked so impressive on the tarmac were useless against the reality of a flood that didn't follow their computer models. Webb's voice cut through the static, strained and urgent. "Command, this is Echo Team. We've reached the evacuation site, but it's compromised. We're trapped in a medical clinic with 6 civilians and 1 wounded local medic. The building's flooding fast, and we've got no way out. Request immediate air support." "Negative on air support," came the response from Harrison's communications officer. "Visibility is 0. Winds are gusting to 70 knots. No helicopter can fly in this." Silence fell over the tent like a weight. Rachel could see the moment when Harrison realized they were out of options. His shoulders sagged as he stared at the tactical display, searching for solutions that simply didn't exist. "Sir," Webb's voice crackled again, weaker now. "The medic. He's not going to make it much longer, and the water's rising. We need something now, or we're all going under." Rachel stepped forward, her hand reaching for the waterproof map case clipped to her belt. Her voice cut through the silence, calm and steady. "I have a route that can reach them." Every head in the tent turned toward her. Harrison looked at her as if she'd materialized from thin air, which, Rachel realized, was probably how he saw her most days. "Specialist." Harrison paused, clearly struggling to remember her name. "Torres, sir. I've been mapping alternate routes through the debris fields. I have a path that avoids the blocked areas. It's narrow, but it's passable for a small craft." Webb's voice broke into laughter, tinged with hysteria. "Command, please tell me you're not considering sending the Kayak girl on a rescue mission. We need real help, not a publicity stunt." Rachel felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but this time it was different. This time, people were dying while trained professionals made excuses about why their expensive equipment couldn't do the job. Harrison shook his head, his expression almost apologetic. "Torres, I appreciate the initiative, but we don't authorize solo rescue operations from support personnel. We need to wait for conditions to improve." "Sir, with respect, conditions aren't going to improve. The flood is accelerating beyond all projections. In 2 hours, that clinic will be completely underwater. The decision is final, specialist." Rachel felt something crack inside her chest, not break, but shift, like a fault line settling into a new position. She looked around the tent at all the expensive equipment, the highly trained personnel, the command structure that was supposed to solve problems like this. All of it useless when faced with something that didn't respond to authority or advanced technology. Her father's voice whispered in her memory, Sometimes, Mia, you have to stop asking for permission and start taking responsibility. Rachel nodded once, crisp and professional. Understood, sir. She turned and walked out of the tent without another word. Behind her, the arguments resumed: who to blame, what equipment to try next, whether to risk a helicopter in impossible conditions. All sound and fury, signifying nothing. The base had grown quieter in the deepening dusk. Rachel walked to her gear station and methodically began her final preparations. She checked the medical kit sealed in her stern compartment, tested the emergency beacon, and verified that the satellite communicator was fully charged and waterproofed. Her hands moved with calm precision, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought might have faltered. This was what her father had trained her for, though neither of them had known it at the time. All those hours learning to read water, to navigate by instinct, to trust her equipment and her skills when everything else failed. Rachel lifted her kayak and carried it to the water's edge. The flood had reached the base perimeter, turning familiar ground into an alien landscape of submerged obstacles and deceptive currents. She could see the path in her mind, the route she'd traced and retraced on her maps, memorized until it lived in her bones. As she settled into the cockpit and adjusted her paddle, Rachel caught sight of her reflection in the dark water. For the first time in 8 months, she didn't look invisible. She looked like exactly what she was, a rescue swimmer's daughter, finally ready to do what rescue swimmers do. She pushed off into the current and let the flood carry her toward people who needed her. Behind her, the lights of the base faded into the storm. Ahead lay the kind of darkness that could only be navigated by someone who'd learned to see with more than just her eyes. The water was colder than Rachel had expected, and it carried the sharp bite of diesel fuel mixed with debris that scraped against her hull like fingernails on metal. She dipped her paddle once, then again, finding the rhythm that would carry her through the next 2 hours. The flood moved with a life of its own, not the gentle current of a river, but something hungry and aggressive that seemed to grab at her kayak with every stroke. This was her element, though. While Webb and his team struggled with boats that needed fuel and clear channels, Rachel moved like she was part of the water itself. Every adjustment was instinctive, every stroke calculated not through conscious thought, but through 20 years of her father's training echoing in her muscle memory. The first turn came fast and alley between 2 half-submerged houses that had narrowed to barely more than her kayak's width. She angled the blade low and leaned into the draw, letting the current push her stern around as she skimmed sideways past a floating doorframe. Above her, a loose shutter creaked once before breaking free and splashing into the flood just feet. Behind her, she didn't flinch. She'd expected obstacles like this, had mapped them on her charts during all those nights when others assumed she was just playing with toys. The blade cut and pulled, the kayak glided forward, and Rachel felt the familiar calm that came when everything else fell away except the immediate demands of navigation. The main boulevard had become a sluggish river, its surface broken by the geometric shapes of submerged cars and the organic curves of floating debris. A child's tricycle drifted in lazy circles near what had been a bus stop, its red paint bright against the brown water. The sight hit her harder than she'd expected, a reminder that this wasn't just an exercise in technical skill. She cut left, between 2 leaning storefronts, following the route she'd memorized from her hand-drawn maps. The rear corridor was supposed to be open if the wind patterns had held, and they had. The alley narrowed again, and she passed under wires strung with market flags, one still fluttering despite being soaked and dragging. Her satellite communicator chirped softly, a message from base asking for a status update. Rachel ignored it. She had nothing to report yet except that Webb's expensive equipment had failed where her 30-year-old kayak design succeeded. They'd want data, coordinates, proof that she was making progress according to their metrics. But the only metric That mattered was whether she reached that clinic in time. The building appeared around the next bend, exactly where her calculations had placed it. The water level was nearly at the second floor, higher than the reports had indicated. The structure leaned but held, one set of windows broken, others fogged with condensation. Rachel circled once, studying the currents around the foundation, then tapped her paddle blade against the metal railing that jutted above the waterline. A figure moved behind the window. It slid open with obvious effort, and Webb's face appeared, stunned and disbelieving. "You," he said, then stopped. He looked around as if expecting to see a helicopter or support boat, some explanation for how this was possible. Rachel reached forward and unhooked the medical kit from her stern cradle, passing it up by the handle. Webb took it like it might vanish if he blinked. "We thought—" Another SEAL appeared in the frame, his voice lower. "We thought you were—" "A boat." Rachel pointed at the satellite communicator pouch and handed that up next. Her movements were economical, professional. She wasn't here to gloat or prove a point. She was here to do a job that no one else could do. "How did you find us?" the second SEAL asked. Rachel looked at him without ceremony or triumph. "I already knew the map." Inside, someone coughed wet, labored breathing that spoke of time running out. One of the SEALs leaned back toward the interior. "We'll need to reorganize gear. How much can you carry?" Rachel rested her paddle across her knees and checked the balance of her kayak. The question wasn't about weight limits or equipment specifications. It was about what mattered most when everything else was stripped away. "Leave only what you don't need," she said. "I'll come back." They looked at her like she'd said something impossible, but then they nodded. Because in that moment, surrounded by rising water with their advanced equipment useless around them, impossible had become the only option that made sense. As Rachel turned her kayak in the tight space between the railing and a floating board, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 8 months of being dismissed and ignored. The quiet satisfaction of being exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she'd been trained to do. The paddle caught a swirl of debris as she pulled away from the building. She freed it without effort, found her rhythm again, and headed back toward base. Behind her, voices faded into the flood. Ahead, the current waited to carry her home. She had work to finish. The water near base had risen another foot by the time Rachel paddled back into view, her kayak sitting lower in the current, weighted down with the gravity of what she'd accomplished. Dusk had thickened into heavy gray, and visibility had dropped, to the point where the drone footage showed only a long silhouette, moving slowly against the surge, barely more than a whisper on the surface. At first, the communications desk wasn't sure what they were seeing. Then the identification pinged. It was the kayak, the one no one had taken seriously. Rachel's figure took shape as she emerged from the bend, paddling steadily against the current that had defeated million-dollar boats just hours earlier. The kayak showed the cost of her journey. One side was scraped raw, paint stripped by debris that would have torn holes in lighter hulls. The bow net was half torn, its edges trailing into the water like battle flags. Her gloves were soaked and split across the palms, and her right sleeve hung in tatters from a collision with submerged metal that had left a bruise running from collarbone to bicep. But her breathing was steady, her stroke never faltered, and the satellite communicator clipped to her life vest blinked green mission accomplished. A small crowd had gathered on the upper platform, officers, technicians, and crew members who had once walked past her without acknowledgement. Now they watched in complete silence as she approached the dock, bumped gently against its edge, and rested one hand on the wood to hold position. She didn't climb up immediately. Rachel had learned to read situations as carefully as she read water, and she could feel the shift in the air around her, the way people looked at her now, like they were seeing her for the first time. She waited for the current to settle, then stood inside the kayak and stepped onto the dock in one smooth motion. Water dripped from every corner of her uniform. Her boots squelched as she moved. Her face was streaked with sweat and floodwater. But her eyes remained steady, focused not on the crowd, but on something beyond them. The knowledge that she'd done what needed doing, regardless of who had or hadn't believed it was possible. From the shadows behind the equipment crates, a figure stepped forward. It was one of Webb's teammates, Petty Officer Ryan Clark, his hair still wet from the clinic evacuation, his hands bearing fresh marks from emergency rope work. He had been among the men she'd pulled out of an impossible situation. Clark didn't speak. He didn't need to. Instead, he stood at attention and gave her a clean, formal salute, the kind reserved for actions that went far beyond the call of duty. Rachel held his gaze for one quiet moment, then nodded in return. It wasn't about recognition or vindication. It was about the simple acknowledgement between professionals who understood what it meant to risk everything for people you'd never met. Up in the operations tent, Public Affairs Officer Diana Knox sat beside her tablet, scrolling through the media queue. She stopped on an image of Rachel's kayak, a still frame taken before, deployment with a mocking caption layered across the bottom. Knox paused, hovering over the delete button, then pressed it without ceremony. Some stories, she realized, deserved to be told properly. Back on the dock, Webb approached without his usual swagger. The man who had spent months making jokes about bathtub rescue operations now couldn't quite meet Rachel's eyes. He reached down, lifted the bow of her kayak, and wordlessly carried it to the storage trailer. The hull rattled slightly from the damage it had sustained, but he steadied it with unexpected care. Rachel adjusted her shoulder strap and turned toward the command tent. She wasn't expecting to be summoned. She never was. But as she walked past the operations center, she caught sight of a junior officer updating the mission log. A soft ping came through the communication system. The satellite link had connected successfully. The recon team was accounted for. The clinic evacuation was stable. The note in the digital record was simple. Objective reached. Torres, solo. Insertion. No one in the tent said her name aloud. No one asked her to explain how she'd succeeded where their advanced equipment had failed. But on the status board by the door, someone had crossed out support observation next to her name and replaced it with field access, cleared. Rachel walked past the row of crates and disappeared into the corridor without comment. Her reflection flickered once in the floodlights, then faded as she moved deeper into the base. On the side of her gear bag, the patch she had kept wrapped and hidden was now visible, pressed against the soaked canvas by the weight of her equipment. The squadron insignia was old, its threadwork thin from time and handling, but it was no longer hidden. For the first time since her father's death, Rachel wore her heritage openly, not as a burden of expectations she couldn't meet, but as a reminder of skills she'd always possessed and values she'd never abandoned. The silence that settled over base wasn't awkward or reverent. It was the kind of silence that comes when the shape of something fundamental changes, and everyone recognizes the shift simultaneously. Rachel Torres had done what no one else could do, and not one person could look away from the implications of that simple fact. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new floods, new impossible situations that would require someone willing to paddle into the darkness. But tonight, for the first time in 8 months, Rachel Torres was visible. The tent felt different when Rachel returned to it that night. The same canvas walls, the same flickering lantern, the same worn map spread across her sleeping mat, but something fundamental had shifted in the space between leaving for the rescue and coming back. She moved with the same methodical care, wiping down her paddle and checking the shaft for stress fractures, but her movements carried a new weight, a certainty that hadn't been there before. Her hands found the nick in the blade edge where it had scraped against submerged metal during The rescue. She filed it smooth with even strokes, the repetitive motion helping her process what had happened out there in the flood. Not just the rescue itself, but the moment when she'd stopped asking for permission and started taking responsibility. The kayak rested nearby, its hull bearing the scars of successful navigation through impossible conditions. Rachel traced the scratches with one finger, each mark a testament to capabilities that went far beyond what anyone had imagined when they saw her working alone by the supply crates. An envelope appeared under her tent flap with a soft shuffle. No knock, no announcement, just a discreet delivery that spoke of someone who understood the value of quiet recognition. Rachel picked it up and opened it without ceremony. Inside was a single typed line: Torres Rachel E., Tactical Field Clearance Approved. On the back, in careful handwriting, were 4 simple words: next time, you lead. Rachel read it once, folded the page, and tucked it into her map case. She didn't need to wonder who had sent it. Lieutenant Commander Harrison might not have authorized her rescue mission, but he was experienced enough to recognize results when he saw them. The real change, though, wasn't in official recognition or updated clearance levels. It was in the sound of voices outside her tent, quieter conversations, fewer jokes, a subtle shift in the base's social dynamics that acknowledged what everyone had witnessed. Rachel pulled out her grease pencil and updated her charts with fresh information from the day's mission. Water levels, current speeds, debris patterns, data that might save lives in future operations. She worked with the same quiet precision that had always characterized her preparation. But now she knew that someone would be watching, learning, maybe even listening when she offered suggestions. Her father's patch lay unwrapped on the cloth beside her, no longer hidden but not displayed for show either. It simply existed as part of her gear, the way it should have all along. Rachel picked it up and studied the faded embroidery in the lantern light. "Stay small, stay ready," she whispered. But the words meant something different now. Small didn't have to mean invisible. Ready didn't require permission. From somewhere across the base, she could hear the distant sound of equipment being reorganized, boats being repaired, and teams debriefing their failed missions. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more floods, more impossible rescues, more situations that required someone willing to go where conventional wisdom said no one could survive. But Rachel Torres was no longer the overlooked specialist working alone by the supply crates. She was the person who had paddled into a disaster zone when million-dollar boats couldn't make the journey, who had reached stranded personnel when advanced technology failed, who had proven that sometimes the quietest voice in the room carried the most important message. She folded her maps, packed her gear, and settled in for what might be her last night as an invisible support specialist. Tomorrow, she would still be the same person with the same skills and the same dedication to helping others. But the world around her had finally learned to see what had always been there. The water was still rising somewhere out in the darkness. People were still waiting for rescue. And Rachel Torres, no longer hidden in the shadows, was ready to answer the call. The morning briefing felt like stepping into an alternate universe. Rachel stood at the back of the operations tent, just as she had for 8 months. But this time, officers turned to acknowledge her presence. Lieutenant Commander Harrison nodded in her direction, a small gesture that would have been visible to most, but carried enormous weight in the rigid hierarchy of military life. "Before we begin today's operational overview," Harrison said, his voice carrying across the assembled personnel, "I want to address yesterday's rescue operation." He paused, letting his words settle. Specialist Torres successfully extracted Echo, team, and 6 civilians from a compromised position using unconventional methods when standard protocols failed. The tent was absolutely silent. Rachel could feel eyes on her, but the attention felt different, now respectful rather than dismissive, curious rather than mocking. Webb stood 2 rows ahead, his shoulders tense, his usual swagger replaced by something that looked almost like shame. Going forward, Harrison continued, we'll be incorporating alternative navigation assessments into our mission planning. Specialist Torres will be consulting on route analysis for small craft operations. Consulting. The word hung in the air like a small miracle. After months of having her suggestions disappear into bureaucratic void, Rachel was being asked officially. Asked to contribute her expertise to mission planning. Martinez from Canadian Command raised his hand. Sir, what about equipment standardization? Are we looking at expanding the Kayak program? Harrison's eyes flicked to Rachel, a subtle invitation to respond. She stepped forward slightly, her voice steady and professional. The Kayak isn't a replacement for standard craft, sir. It's a specialized tool for specific conditions, high debris environments, shallow water insertion, situations where stealth and maneuverability matter more than payload capacity. Webb turned to look at her directly for the first time in months. What about extraction capability? You can't pull out large teams. No, sir, but I can establish communication links, deliver critical supplies, and guide larger rescue operations to viable approach routes. Rachel's tone remained neutral, factual. Yesterday's mission demonstrated that sometimes reaching the objective is more important than arriving with maximum force. A murmur of agreement rippled through the tent. Rachel noticed several officers taking notes, their attention focused and genuine. Public Affairs Officer Diana Knox had her tablet out, but instead of monitoring social media feeds, she was documenting tactical insights. The briefing continued with weather updates and flood projections, but something fundamental had shifted. When technical questions arose, officers glanced toward Rachel. When alternative approaches were discussed, her input was specifically requested. She was no longer invisible support personnel. She was a tactical asset whose capabilities were finally being utilized properly. After the briefing ended, Webb approached her as she gathered her materials. The cocky SEAL, who had spent months making jokes about her equipment, now looked genuinely uncomfortable. Torres, he started, then stopped. He ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling with words that didn't come naturally. Yesterday, what you did. He paused again, then met her eyes. I was wrong. About the Kayak, about your capabilities. I'm sorry. Rachel studied his face, looking for signs of performance or manipulation. She found neither, just the awkward sincerity of someone confronting their own prejudices. Apology accepted, petty. Officer Webb. The thing is, Webb continued, I've been thinking about it all night. When our boats failed, when the helicopters couldn't fly, when every piece of advanced technology on this base was useless, you just went. No drama. No big speeches. You just did what needed doing. Rachel nodded. That's the job. No. Webb said, shaking his head. That's more than the job. That's single quotes, double quotes. He searched for the right word. That's leadership. The words settled around them like a challenge. Leadership wasn't about rank or recognition. It was about seeing what needed to be done and having the courage to do it, regardless of who was watching or whether anyone would thank you afterward. As Rachel walked back to her gear station, she noticed the change in how people looked at her. The dismissive glances were gone, replaced by professional respect and genuine curiosity. A junior technician asked about her paddle technique. A logistics coordinator wanted to understand her route planning methodology. She was still the same person with the same skills, but the world had finally learned to see her clearly. The invisible specialist had become visible not through self-promotion or political maneuvering, but through the simple act of being competent when competence mattered most. Rachel reached her gear area and began preparing for whatever challenge the day might bring. Her kayak sat ready, her maps were updated, and her equipment was in perfect condition. But more importantly, she was no longer preparing in isolation. She was part of the team now, not because someone had finally noticed her, but because she had proven that being overlooked didn't diminish capability. It just made success more surprising when it arrived. 6 months later, Rachel Torres stood before a joint military review board in a conference room that smelled of polished wood and fresh coffee. The walls were lined with commendation plaques and photographs of distinguished service members, but she wasn't intimidated by the formal setting. She'd learned that real authority came from competence, not ceremony. Specialist Torres, the reviewing admiral began. Your actions during the coastal flood emergency have been documented and reviewed extensively. The techniques you employed and the results you achieved have implications far beyond a single rescue operation. Rachel sat straight in her chair, her dress uniform crisp and properly fitted. The squadron patch her father had given her was now displayed openly on her sleeve, no longer hidden but worn with quiet pride. Thank you, sir. The board has reviewed recommendations from Lieutenant Commander Harrison, testimonials from the Padaeans, personnel you rescued, and technical assessments of your modified equipment. We're prepared to offer you a position with the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, developing small craft insertion protocols for extreme conditions. It was the kind of opportunity that would have seemed impossible 8 months ago when she was invisible support personnel working alone by the supply crates. But Rachel had learned something important during those months of being overlooked. Recognition was nice, but it wasn't necessary for doing meaningful work. I'm honored by the offer, sir, she said carefully, but I'd like to make a counter-proposal. The admiral raised an eyebrow. Very few people made counter-proposals to the Naval Special Warfare Development Group. I'd like to establish a training program for unconventional rescue methods, Rachel continued. Not just kayaks, but all the techniques that get overlooked when we focus on high-tech solutions. Small boat navigation, improvised equipment repair, alternative route analysis skills that matter when the expensive gear fails. She paused, gathering her thoughts. What happened during the flood wasn't unique to that situation. There are always going to be times when the standard approach doesn't work, when someone needs to think differently and act independently. We should be training people for those moments instead of hoping they'll figure it out on their own. The admiral leaned back in his chair, clearly intrigued. You want to teach people to be invisible? I want to teach them to be self-sufficient, Rachel corrected. To trust their training even when nobody's watching, to prepare thoroughly even when nobody asks, and to act decisively when conventional wisdom says it's impossible. The other board members exchanged glances. This wasn't the response they'd expected from someone being offered a prestigious assignment. The flood emergency revealed something important, Rachel continued. We had millions of dollars in equipment, highly trained personnel, and sophisticated planning, but when conditions exceeded our parameters, none of it mattered. What mattered was having someone willing to use simple tools effectively and take responsibility for outcomes. The admiral nodded slowly. You're talking about more than technical training. Yes, sir. I'm talking about changing how we think about capability and leadership. Some of our most valuable people are the ones who work quietly, prepare meticulously, and deliver results without fanfare. But our systems are designed to overlook them until crisis forces us to pay attention. Rachel thought about Webb, who had become one of her strongest advocates after learning to see past his own assumptions. She thought about the junior technicians, who now asked her questions about equipment modification and route planning. She thought about her father, who had taught her that the most important work often happened in the shadows. The program I'm proposing would identify and develop those overlooked capabilities before they're needed in crisis situations. We'd teach people to trust their judgment, to work independently, and to find solutions when conventional approaches fail. The room was quiet for a long moment. Finally, the Admiral smiled, a genuine expression of respect and approval. Specialist Torres, I think you've just described exactly what the Navy needs. Consider your proposal accepted, with one modification. He paused. You'll be doing this as Chief Petty Officer Torres. The promotion hit her like a gentle wave, unexpected but somehow inevitable. Rachel felt a familiar calm settle over her. The same quiet confidence that had carried her through the floodwaters 6 months ago. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. I don't think that's possible, the Admiral replied. Someone who paddles into a disaster zone alone doesn't understand the concept of letting people down. 2 years later, the Torres method, as it had come to be known, was being implemented across multiple branches of the military. Rachel's training program produced specialists who could think creatively under pressure, work effectively with minimal resources, and lead through competence rather than authority. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had become famous for teaching people to be invisible. Her office at the Naval Special Warfare Facility was small and practical, decorated with charts and equipment diagrams rather than awards and photographs. The same faded squadron patch hung in a simple frame on her desk, still worn but no longer hidden. Rachel often thought about that night in the storage tent when she had traced flood routes by lantern light, believing that her work would never be seen or valued. She had been wrong about the recognition, but right about the work itself. The skills her father had taught her, the maps she had drawn in solitude, the quiet preparation that others had dismissed, all of it had mattered more than she could have imagined. The real victory wasn't in being noticed. It was in never losing faith that competence and dedication would eventually find their place in the world. Sometimes the strongest voice was indeed the one that said nothing at all, until the moment came when action spoke louder than words. Rachel Torres had paddled out of the shadows and into a role she never could have planned but was perfectly prepared to fill. The invisible specialist had become a visible leader, but she carried with her the most important lesson from her time in the darkness. The work itself was always more important than who was watching. In a world that often confused volume with value and visibility with worth, Rachel had proven that quiet competence could change everything. She had stopped asking for permission and started taking responsibility, and in doing so, had given others permission to do the same. The floodwaters had receded long ago, but the ripples from her courage continued to spread, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways that would never be fully measured. Sometimes, the most important victories were the ones that happened one person at a time, in the hearts of those who learned to see their own worth clearly. And somewhere in the darkness, another overlooked specialist was preparing for their moment to paddle into the light. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Have you ever been underestimated at work or in life? Share your own story of quiet perseverance in the comments. Your experience might inspire someone else who's feeling invisible right now. Thanks for joining us for another incredible tale of courage, determination, and the power of proving yourself through actions rather than words. Until next time, keep believing in your own quiet strength.